Pilla talks taxes. He has been for over 45 years, and there's not a human on the planet with more experience solving problems on behalf of taxpayers. He wants to solve your problem whether you know you have one or not. So if you do have a tax problem, get a hold of his office, visit his website. If you don't have a tax problem, your current tax problem is taxes themselves. So let's get into the policy issues of today. The main one being the government is still shut down. Are we finally into the longest government shutdown ever, or is that still a week out yet?
We got to be getting close, Josh, because the longest shutdown ever was December of 2018 into January of 2019, and that was 35 days. Now, I haven't counted the number of days, but we got to be real close to that now, if not over it already.
I know we're up to 3 weeks of talking about it, and we took a week off. So at this point, we're beginning to wonder, what are we paying taxes for?
I understand that the Democrats have dug in and they're determined to keep the government shut down until somebody notices. And apparently nobody in the private sector has really noticed yet the fact that the federal government is shut down. Now,
only significant notice that I have seen, the only significant repercussion I have seen is the absolute horrendous nightmare happening at Houston Airport with the TSA. But that shouldn't even be a government sector in the first place. That's probably another
discussion. I'll be heading to the airport later today myself, and I'll see for myself what's going on in Minneapolis and then later in Chicago. But here's the thing, Josh. The fact of the matter is, a guy in my position that's dealing with the Internal Revenue Service during a shutdown becomes very frustrating, because you can't get a hold of the people in the Internal Revenue Service that you need to deal with in order to get your clients' cases resolved. Now, the fact is that there's certain aspects of the IRS that are still operating. They're still doing some basic functions. We talked about this in a prior podcast as to what elements of the IRS are staying open. But the fact is, not everybody's open. The most important part, in my opinion, in a situation like this is the Office of the Taxpayer Advocate. You have taxpayers out there that are having problems with the IRS that need to get resolved, and those problems don't go away just because the federal government shuts down. That becomes very difficult. Now, I do know the Office of the Taxpayer Advocate is still functioning, but they are on a skeleton crew. How long is it going to take to get a person to look at your case and then respond? I've had some success in one case over the last 30 days where I've gotten some action, but I can't say that's going on across the board. As a skeleton crew, we just don't know. So that is difficult. It's one thing for the federal government to shut down and stop reaching into every aspect of every person's private life. That's a good, but the problem is the tax burdens don't go away. The obligations to comply with the income tax don't go away. And so you still have some automated notices that are going out. Automated systems in the IRS are still operating. So people are still getting certain notices from the IRS. They're still getting certain communications, and certain people panic when they get these letters. They don't know what they mean. They don't know what to do. And so you got to have some capacity to deal with the agency. And there's very little of that right now. And that gets frustrating, no doubt about that.
Even when the IRS is around to take calls, they don't take 75% of the calls. It's a struggle now that they are taking almost 0% of the calls from consumers, from taxpayers. At this point, if someone is getting one of those automated letters, they're going to panic. They're going to try to call the IRS, and they're going to get nowhere. So what is someone supposed to do when they receive one of these automated letters when the government is shut down?
The question is, what letter are you getting, Josh? That's the big thing. The single biggest problem that people have with the IRS is they don't recognize the letters that the agency is sending out. There's hundreds of different types of letters that the agency mails, and only a handful, maybe a dozen or 18 letters that have any important significance and downside if you don't react. The first thing you got to do is understand what kind of letter you're. In my book, The IRS Problem Solver, is so important because I have a couple chapters in the book that break down what these letters are and explain to you how you do respond if you get one. Let's talk about two of the critical notices that people receive from the IRS. Number one is called a notice of deficiency. This is a letter that says the IRS has determined that you owe additional taxes. This gives you an opportunity to file a petition in the United States Tax Court. This notice of deficiency is a final administrative determination that the IRS makes that says you owe more money. Now, the U.S. Tax Court is part of the federal government, and their operations are mostly shut down, but they still have a skeleton crew there that will receive notices of deficiency. So you have to file a petition with the United States Tax Court on time. That's a 90-day in order to prevent the assessment of that tax liability. You have an opportunity to deal with the IRS's Office of Appeals and, if necessary, an IRS attorney or even a tax court judge to get your case straightened out. The other critical notice, Josh, is a final notice of intent to levy. That's IRS notice T11 or CP90, or it could be a 1058. There's three different letters identified three different ways.
Because why make it easy?
Yeah, why make make it easy. Exactly. But they all say the same thing. This letter comes to people who already have a tax assessment. They already owe the money, right? And so this letter says this is your final notice of intent to levy. This is your right to a collection due process hearing. If you do the tax within 30 days, the IRS can enforce collection with wage levies, bank levies, property seizures, and tax liens. Or if you file a request for a collection due process appeal within that 30-day period, the IRS can't do anything. All right. So as long as you submit a response to that final notice letter at the address indicated on the final notice letter by filing IRS form 12153, that's called a request for collection due process hearing, all collection action stops. They can't levy a paycheck, a bank account, nothing. As long as that appeal is pending, they can take no enforcement action. And now you've got the opportunity to go to the IRS's Office of Appeals, where you will get some kind of resolution to your case. So during the shutdown, they still have staff that's receiving these letters and at least recording them as having been filed. This is the way to avoid levy action. The problems arise when you've already received these final notice letters for years past and you haven't taken this act. Now the IRS can issue automated collection, and that becomes a difficult thing to stop during a government shutdown, except this is where I would point people to the Office of the Taxpayer Advocate. Their fax numbers are on the IRS's website, so you can get those contact numbers for the Taxpayer Advocate. Lean on the Taxpayer Advocate. Yes, they have a skeleton crew, but at least it's some hope of getting some contact with somebody in the IRS who can help you in an enforcement situation.
So if you get hit with a notice of determination, they say you owe them more money, you got to hit them with the I disagree, send them a letter that says that essentially, and get yourself on the appeals list. Is that more or less?
Well, yeah, that's exactly right. But let's make sure that we're talking about let's be clear about the two different types of letters. The first letter, notice of deficiency, that's a determination that you owe money. And yes, Josh, your response is, I disagree, I don't owe this money. But that response has to go to the United States Tax Court, not the IRS. A notice of deficiency is final administrative determination that you owe money. If you look at my book, How to Win Your Tax Audit, in chapter 13 of that book, I walk you step by step through the audit process. The culmination of that process is the issuance of a notice of deficiency, and then you're right to go to tax. All right, when we're talking about tax collection, tax determination is one thing. That's the notice of determination or notice of deficiency. Tax collection is done through the final notice letter.
Let me stop you for a second to clarify something here. So you've used two D words, determination and deficiency. Is that effectively saying the same thing, or are those two separate situations?
In the strictest technical sense, they're two different things, but I don't want to get too far off into the weeds here, Josh. Let's keep the cart going down the middle of the fairway here for just a second. Notice of deficiency is the correct legal description of the IRS's final administrative determination that you owe money. It's their decision that we think you owe more money, and if you don't disagree, you have to go to the tax court to straighten it out. Notice of deficiency is the letter. The letter communicates the IRS's determination that you owe more money. So we clear on that? That's an audit process. Now we go into the collection process. The collection process is begun in earnest with the final notice of intent to levy and notice of your right to a hearing. 30-day appeal deadline. You appeal that determination by submitting IRS form 12153, which is a request for a collection due process hearing. That moves the case out of the hands of the collection function and into the hands of the appeals office. And that's where you have an opportunity to sit down with an appeals officer and work out a resolution to the amount you versus tax court determining whether you owe it. The appeals office determines how you can pay it or whether you can pay it at all. So there's two different discussions here: determination of the tax, collection of the tax. That's where these two processes become very important.
So when they're determining that you owe the tax, that's when you can still disagree with them and get yourself off of the collection slate. And once they're collecting at that point, you have to go to the taxpayer advocate to get them to stop the collection process.
If you're already in the midst of collection, all right? Once they've made that assessment, and after they've issued that final notice of intent to levy, they're going to issue or potentially issue wage levies and bank levies. And if they do it during the government shutdown, how are you going to call somebody to get it reversed? That's where the Office of the Taxpayer Advocate comes into play. So these processes are very important to understand. And of course, the vast majority of people don't understand it because the IRS deliberately makes it complicated.
You explained it to me 3 times and I barely understand it, to be fair.
But that's why my books are so important, Josh. My book, How to Get Tax Amnesty, lays this stuff out, step by step, easy to understand. You don't have to know anything about tax law or tax procedure to work your way through these books and understand exactly what's going on and exactly what to do to get your situation under control. For purposes of our discussion on this podcast, you need to know that the Office of the Taxpayer Advocate can help when there's a levy issued and you can't get a hold of somebody in the IRS to get it stopped.
The Taxpayer Advocate is one of those institutions that actually works for the taxpayer instead of against it and is vital.
Let's understand exactly what the Taxpayer Advocate is and what they do. The Office of the Taxpayer Advocate is set up to function as a liaison between the IRS and the taxpayer. The Taxpayer Advocate's office has a chain of command that's completely outside of all of the IRS enforcement functions, right? The critical enforcement functions are examination, the audit people, collections, the guy that knocks on your door or levies your bank account, a criminal investigation. These are the people that conduct investigations to determine whether a crime was committed. And then you got the Office of Appeals, which is outside enforcement as well, but it deals with these enforcement functions. The Office of the Taxpayer Advocate's chain of command does not answer to any of the enforcement functions. Their responsibility is to advocate on behalf of the taxpayer when the IRS's normal channels have failed. When the IRS is carrying out actions they shouldn't be, like a levy, or failing to carry out actions they're supposed to, like issuing a refund, for example, that the taxpayer is owed. Normal channels have failed to get that fixed. Now the Taxpayer Advocate can step in and help the taxpayer stop the IRS from taking action they shouldn't take, or force the IRS to take action if the IRS's actions or lack of actions are causing a hardship. This is an important function of the Taxpayer Advocate. They have the authority to issue taxpayer assistance order. That taxpayer assistance order is pointed at any one of the enforcement functions and orders the IRS to take this action. All right. Now, an important thing to note about a taxpayer assistance order: no IRS enforcement function can reverse a taxpayer assistance order once it's issued by the Office of the Taxpayer Advocate. This is an important thing for people to know. In my book, The IRS Problem Solver, I've got a whole chapter that deals with the Office of the Taxpayer Advocate and shows you how to work your way through this.
So it sounds like the Taxpayer Advocate is that public defender that they're supposed to give you on steroids, but it doesn't seem like they give them enough money in my mind.
And this has been my complaint for the last, 25 years. The IRS is overfunding enforcement and underfunding taxpayer assistance, education, and outreach. And the reason I say they're overfunding enforcement is because only 2% of all of the revenue that the Internal Revenue collects is collected through enforcement action. We're talking about almost $5 trillion of revenue paid into the IRS every year. Only 2% of that revenue is done through enforcement actions, wage levies, bank levies, and so on. 98% of all the money that's paid to the IRS is paid by taxpayers and businesses voluntarily without IRS intervention, without the strong arm, without some guy on the docks breaking your thumb.
Oh, just the threat of breaking the thumbs is enough to make people do it.
That's exactly right. People will pay the tax they owe and do the things they're supposed to do if they understand what they're supposed to do. All right. And so this is why education and assistance is so important.
Not to mention simplification, but that's not what we're talking about right now.
No, what we're talking about right now is specifically the Office of the Taxpayer Advocate. Right. The Office of the Taxpayer Advocate needs to be funded. And I hate to use the phrase fully funded. I don't know what the heck that means, but they need to have enough resources to effectively and efficiently help the people that are coming to that office for assistance. And even without the shutdown, Josh, they don't have the staff they need to help the people that need help.
There's a new bill. That's not really so new because we've talked about it a number of times, but there's a bill proposal going on that would drastically increase the power of the Taxpayer Advocate. Do you have any updates on that?
Yeah, what you're talking about is the Taxpayer Assistance and Service Act, Josh. As a matter of fact, that Taxpayer Assistance and Service Act, I talked about this at length at my defense conference here at the end of October. The Taxpayer Assistance and Service Act is still slogging its way through Congress. And of course, in the last probably 45 days or 60 days, there's been no attention paid to it at all because of the budget issues preoccupying Congress, the House, and the Senate. So they paid no attention to this. This is a very important piece of legislation. It needs to get passed. I continue to believe that it will be passed. The question is just one of time. It will increase the power of the Taxpayer Advocate and add additional funding to the Office of the Taxpayer Advocate. No doubt about that. So this is something that will help taxpayers in the long run.
What would an IRS look like that proportioned its funding in the proper ways? You said only 2% of its collection is done by enforcement. What would it look like if only 2% of its budget went to enforcement?
I'm not sure you can draw that correlation, Josh, just because 2% of the revenue is collected through enforcement action, that you only have to spend 2% of the IRS's budget on enforcement activities. I'm not sure it's that simple, but no question about the fact that it's imbalanced. There's just no doubt about that. A more realistically balanced IRS, in my opinion, would heavily focus on taxpayer education, would heavily focus pre-filing taxpayer assistance. So that what that means is having people in the Internal Revenue Service that are properly trained, properly educated. We have a phone system in the Internal Revenue Service that's capable of answering phone calls by people who are properly trained and educated to help people comply on the front end. This front end compliance, this front end pre-filing assistance is vitally important to our tax system, because most people will do what they're supposed to do if they know what they're supposed to do. And I'll give you an example of this. Every single tax filing season, the IRS receives up to 100 million phone calls a year, Josh. Now think about this. Put this in perspective. Last year, there was about 165 million individual income tax returns filed with the IRS. So they're getting 100 million phone calls from taxpayers with questions about what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to do it. A lot of those calls are people trying to set up payment plans. They owe money and they're trying to figure out a way to pay it, all right? But nevertheless, these are people taking responsibility for their actions and obligations, doing the things they're supposed to do. We have an IRS that can't field those phone calls, Josh. They can't take 100 million phone calls. And even if they could, they don't have the staff properly trained and educated to give the right information to people to help them. So this is what an IRS would look like in my mind: pre-filing taxpayer assistance that will help people get the information they need, and a taxpayer advocate system that's properly staffed, funded, and trained. On the back end, when you've got post-filing problems, those advocates working for the taxpayer and not IRS enforcement are there to help sort those problems out.
All of that is makeup on the pig, because realistically what we need to do is gut the whole thing, get rid of the IRS entirely, cut the income tax entirely, switch it over, because you can't scale for infinite growth. Our system is this idea that we want to grow continuously. We want this growth that continuously moves up. And if we're going to continuously grow our GDP, that means we are going to continuously have to grow the system that slurps off of the GDP. And there's no end to it.
You're exactly right. Lipstick on a pig is a good way to put it. If I were to make just one argument for the abolition of the income tax in the Internal Revenue Service, you made me just pick one thing to stand on. I already said what it is. 100 million phone calls a year into the Internal Revenue Service by people looking for help, trying to understand what the law requires of them.
Trying to give the government their money and can't even get their phone call answered.
We can't think of a system that's more efficient and more simple than one that requires 100 million phone calls a year into the agency. There's something wrong with it. There's something fundamentally wrong with that.
I can't disagree with that. Thanks for watching, taxpayers. And remember, there's no such thing as a hopeless tax case. And if you think yours is the exception, get a hold of Dan here. He will help you see the daylight. Dan, tell them where else they can follow along with your taxpayers' rights crusade.
All right. I'm at Pilla Talks Taxes. I'm primarily on TikTok, Facebook, True Social, and right here on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe and share these videos, especially with your state and federal representatives, your United States Senator, your state representatives as well. We got to straighten the tax system in most of the states in this country also. If you've got a tax problem right now, go to my website, TaxHelpOnline.com. You buy any book off my website at any price point, and you get a free 15-minute consultation directly and personally with me. I can get you straightened out. Don't go another day with these tax problems hanging over your head. Go to TaxHelpOnline.com right now.